time the middle class taxpayer gets a break. Increased expenses, a weak global economic outlook, all of this has made this segment of taxpayers feel like they need some kind of relief as far as direct taxes are concerned. It has been quite a while as well since there has been any real relief for the income taxpayer. Now, ET Now is learning that there may be some cheer after all, especially when it comes to the new tax regime that was introduced in 2020. Let me first go across to my colleague Prakash for the latest on that story.
Yes, taxpayers may get relief from the union budget, which is going to be tabled on February 1st, 2023. Sources are informing that the government may announce some changes in new tax slab structure. The changes could be made to encourage taxpayers to adopt new tax slab structure going forward. As you are aware that under new tax slab structure, taxpayers may get relief in income tax rate without exemption. But as far as adoption rate is concerned, it is not as high as it was anticipated by the government. So making it more attractive, government is now mulling to provide some relief under new tax slab structure. Sources are also informing that government may announce enhancement in exemption limit on income, which is rupees 2.5 lakhs now. Also, income up to 20 lakhs may be brought in under 20% tax structure under new regime. As you are aware that the industry have made their representation to the finance ministry during pre-budget consultation to provide much needed relief to the consumer. To increase consumption in the country. It may also help industry to grow further on back of increased consumption and demand. So taking all into consideration, government is now mulling to provide some relief in new tax structure, and that could be announced in the budget.
All right, Divya Baweja, partner Deloitte, with me on the show. Monika Halan, author Let's Talk Money, joining me as well. I'm also speaking with Shailesh Haribhakti, chairman of Shailesh Haribhakti Associates. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us this evening on the India Development Debate as we talk budget. Monika Halan, let me begin with your take on the premise. Now, of course, these are reports that they may tweak the new tax regime. We'll have to wait and see what actually happens in the budget. But how important is the requirement now to make that new tax regime more attractive? And is there the scope for it for the finance minister?
Tamanna, first of all, this government leaks very little. So whether the reports are true or not, we don't know. We'll find out in a few days. But I don't think this government is into leaking any of these news reports. Second is there scope? If we look at the direct tax collections till December, the picture is very good. So in terms of that, there is scope. But if you look at the overall budget, we are still in a very tight corner because of COVID, because of the war. We still have some distance to go. Private investment is yet to pick up. The government still needs to put money for infrastructure. So yes, there is a little bit of breathing room. What will they do? My sense is they will try and incentivize people to move to the new tax regime, which has 7 slabs along with the surcharge. It becomes 11 effective, not slabs, but effective slabs because of the surcharge. I would imagine that to nudge people to move to the new tax regime, they will have to do more than they have done in the past, so that you give up the whole regime of exemptions, deductions, and trying to get that rebate to move to a lower tax status. So unless the government does that, we are not seeing much uptick in people opting for the new tax regime. So if anything, that's where I predict there could be a change. I would be really surprised if they gave something to the old tax regime. Tamanna.
There was a comment recently from the finance minister saying, I am also middle class. I understand their problems. But that comment seemed to say, don't worry, I will not add more tax burden. It didn't seem to have any promise of reducing it. There's no actual figure, but Mr. Shailesh Haribhakti, the general sense seems to be that the new tax regime has not been very popular. Is there any insight you can share on that? Why not? Because on the face of it, and we've been showing the side-by-side comparison, you do pay a lower tax on those same slabs.
It is a question of people getting so badly beaten up by inflation. Inflation is a tax which comes in without any warning, and it hits the middle class most acutely. And therefore, people are not wanting to pay any tax more than is absolutely necessary. My take is that we will see either an expansion of the slabs and a exemption limit being raised, because the middle class does deserve a little bit of relief from inflation, and tax, if it can be, the burden can be reduced, that will be a very significant signal from the government that it has its heart in the middle class mind.
Mr. Baweja, let's begin with, like I said, we don't know whether they will do it or not, or to what extent they will do it. But whenever in the last few years, the government has been asked about what has happened for the middle class taxpayer, the new tax regime is given as an option. And the idea behind it was to wean people away from exemptions. But that doesn't seem to have really happened, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right, Tamanna. We have not seen that. And in fact, if you were to compare, in many cases, you will see that the old regime with all the exemptions and deductions which are available turns out to be more beneficial than the new tax regime. I think that is one of the main reasons why not many people have opted for new tax regime compared to what the government would have thought. So yes, you're right. That is really a challenge right now.
Of the requirement for tax relief, Mr. Baweja, do you hope to see some kind of tax relief at this point for direct taxpayers? Do you think the scope for it exists?
Yeah, so as my learned panel members also suggested, I think there is a need to really widen the slabs. And I think more important is also, if you see the highest tax rate of 30%, I think there's a need to bring it down to 25%. So that there is some relief to the taxpayers, and I think that will be important. Even the slabs, when we look at in the new tax regime, also, I think there's a need to tweak that as well, so that the relief is more comparatively. Yeah.
Monika Halan, the context right now for this conversation, for the demand for tax relief for income taxpayers is A, inflation, B, we have an economic outlook where you don't know how incomes are going to look like. You also have a constant improvement in GST revenues for the central government. In that sense, do you think it's high time that they actually make some adjustments, and what exactly, in your view, should they do?
Tamanna, there is, the fact is that India might face a slowdown, but we are not going to slip into a recession like most of the developed world. So it isn't as if our salaries, the middle class who's typically salaried is going to suffer the consequences of a very sharp recession. So I'm not sure if we can say that there are very, very tough times ahead. In fact, India today looks like a shining light in the rest of the world. I mean, that's what we were hearing from all the reports coming on from Davos, that it actually is one of the things which is looking like a beacon in overall darkness. So let me put that point aside. I think that a top tax rate of 30% is really the norm in most of the countries. And when you start adding the surcharge of the super rich, you're getting a top tax slab of 42.7. So in terms of tinkering with getting 30 down to 25, I would be very surprised if they do it, because
if I may, Ms. Halan, which countries are you comparing with when you talk about the top tax rate at 30% plus surcharges? Because then we also have to see the amenities or what the government is providing for taxpayers in those specific countries.
Right. It's a chicken and egg problem, Tamanna. Unless we expand the tax base, unless more people pay tax, we are not going to have the money for amenities. And it's a completely different question as to how this tax revenue has got spent in the past. Okay, so, however far back you want to look in the past, how has the money, the tax revenue and the non-tax revenue of the government, how has it been spent? How have the borrowings been spent? So we can go around this point that should the amenities come first or should we expand the tax base? We were not going to move to a middle income country. We are already low. We've moved from the poor income tag to a low middle tag, but we are not going to do that unless more people pay tax and the tax base is expanded. So when I'm comparing, I'm just saying that these are this is the tax that we pay for having been a really poor country and being part of a middle class in still a country where you qualify as middle class and you qualify as rich at $10 per person per day. So this is our situation of $2,000 per capita income. We will have to wait before we start expecting the kind of amenities that we see in the developed West with $40,000, $60,000 per capita income, Tamanna.
In that sense, this question about a 25% tax rate that Mr. Baweja spoke about, I think it also brings you on par with industry, isn't it? Where the top tax rate for industry is 25% because you want to incentivize industry. You would hope at least you pay the same. You want to comment on that, Monika?
Yeah, just one thing that whereas it's easier to deal with the industry lobby in terms of increasing the 25 back to 30, the middle class would be very difficult to raise this 25 back to 30. So I would be very surprised if they tinker with this top margin of 30%.
Well, a middle class has no lobby. So there's this amorphous group who's constantly taxed and no one really to speak up for them. Mr. Baweja, we're talking just about the basic income tax here, but for this section, looking at the reality of today, what can be done? Even exemptions like for your housing interest or principal, those limits are now redundant, honestly, looking at the cost of housing. The exemptions you have for medical examinations, on an annual basis, completely redundant. For education, completely redundant. And then there are new realities post-pandemic from a work-from-home kind of situation. So what are the other factors that can be at least taken into account to acknowledge the new reality, if nothing else?
Yeah. So a couple of things that can be looked at, one is, as you rightly said, the current limits for whether it is ATC for various deductions or whether it is for medical insurance premium, they have been constant for a very long time. And looking at the current realities, I think it's time for government to really raise those limits. At least ATC, there's a demand has been made for a few years now. I think it's time to increase it to, say, 2.5 lakhs. Even when we look at the rising medical cost and consequently with health insurance premium going up, I think the limit for health insurance premium also needs to be doubled. And you raised a very interesting point, Tamanna, on the post-pandemic scenario. So we have seen, post-pandemic, many companies moving to a hybrid model, work from home. I think there's a time for the tax laws to address some of these, giving some benefits or addressing some of the points which are there, be it working from home, to see if some relief can be given. The only thing which employers which employees are availing is more in the context of the broadband and all, for which there is, benefit can be taken for working from home. That also because it talks about that for any broadband charges, you can get a deduction. But I think there's a need to relook at the various limits for deductions as well as, the new emerging employment scenarios, be it hybrid model or working from home.
Mr. Haribhakti, I remember when GST was first launched, one of the points of GST was that even as we wait for the tax base to increase, GST will make it more robust, a more robust system for the government, increase revenues, maybe as a pipe dream among its many outcomes was that the income tax will also reduce. Has that flown out of the window completely now, even as GST gets more robust and stronger?
Not at all. I think GST is in for simplification, and so is the tax regime. My big expectation from this budget, because we must be mindful of the fact that this budget will be extended because the elections will be too close to the end of the next budget period. And so this may well hold good for maybe another at least 3 to 6 months. And therefore, I believe this will be a budget when the bold step of rationalizing taxes for the middle class will happen through two measures. One, an increase in the exemption limit, and two, a rationalization of the slabs. I think the exemptions will not go up very significantly. There might be omnibus kind of exemptions that might come, one for savings, one for digital public goods availability, and things like that. So my own way of thinking tells me that because of the buoyancy that we have seen and the much larger compliance, we will see this kind of tax relief for the middle class very visible in the next budget.
Well, fingers crossed. Let's hope for good messaging at least coming out of the budget. That's an important factor that Mr. Haribhakti touched upon. I want to wrap this here, but I want to thank all of you for joining us on this conversation as we wait and see what comes up in the scope of personal income taxes in budget 2023. But on to some news from